Leo Tolstoy. When he was still a young man, Leo Tolstoy said, "There is something in me which compels me to believe that I was not born to be like everybody else." He was not like everybody else, and in fact, he wasn't like anyone else. Most people know Tolstoy as the author of the epic Russian novels War and Peace and Anna Karenina. Most people know he was one of the greatest and perhaps the greatest novelist of all time. Yet the classic books of Tolstoy are but one aspect of an extraordinary life, a life lived in a desperate search for the truth and for human perfection. Tolstoy is a man who struggled almost from childhood against the circumstances and nature of his own being. He was born a nobleman, a count, and yet he rejected elitism. He was born on a lavish estate, yet he denounced private property. He inherited great wealth and became even wealthier through his work, yet he tried to dispose of his money and material possessions. There were hundreds of serfs on his land, but he abhorred oppression. The life of leisure and luxury was his for the asking, yet he chose to toil in the fields with the peasants. He was a man of enormous passions and vitality, who adopted a life of denial and asceticism. And from the time he was young, he was filled with a longing for God. Yet he spent many years praying to know if God was real. And all of this he did because he was a man dedicated to finding and living the higher purpose of life. His quest caused him severe anguish and suffering. Tolstoy was prone to deep black depressions, to outbursts of anger and frustration, and to mental torment so agonizing that he often thought he had gone insane, as did those around him. But in the end, he produced not just masterpieces of fiction, but a life that has served as an inspiration to thousands of others, political idealists, philosophers, educators, and ordinary seekers on the path to truth. The unusual life of Leo Tolstoy began on September 9, 1828, on his family estate near Moscow called Yasnaya Polyana, which means clear glade. It was a wonderful place to spend one's childhood. There were thousands of acres in the rolling countryside, a river for swimming or catching crayfish, lakes that froze in winter for skating, forests filled with wild game, ponies for riding, and the big white mansion with its porticos and many windows that looked out over the wooded hills. In the house were 30 servants, and outside were the cottages of the hundreds of serfs who worked the fields and forests. Serfdom had been accepted as a normal way of life in Russia for many centuries when Leo Tolstoy was born. The czars, the nobility, and the church held immense power over the serfs, who each year grew deeper in debt to their masters. Many serfs owned a hut and a small piece of land, but they themselves were owned by the family of the estate. Anything they produced on their little plot had to be shared with the master. These masters could buy and sell them, control their marriages and their lives. Some, but not the Tolstoys, regularly flogged the serfs as punishment for misdeeds. Leo and his 3 brothers and sister were descended from a long line of aristocrats that included princes, counts, diplomats, governors, generals, and politicians. Leo's mother died when he was 2, giving birth to his little sister, Maria, so he had little memory of her. But his father he always remembered, a handsome and charming man, always surrounded by pipe smoke and always willing to listen. Leo also always remembered a childhood game he played with his brothers. They would search in the woods for hours at a time for an imaginary green stick that had the secret of world peace and happiness inscribed in it. Leo took the game so seriously that, in his mind, the stick ceased to be imaginary. When he was an adult, he wrote, "We called it a game, but really everything in the world is a game except that." As a child, and even as an adult, Leo Tolstoy found himself ugly. He sat in front of a mirror trying different expressions he hoped would improve his looks. He had small gray eyes that were close together, bristly hair, and a wide, prominent nose. Once he shaved his eyebrows off in hopes it might make him look more handsome, but then he was too embarrassed to be seen at all. There were bigger problems than vanity to deal with, however. When he was only 9 years old, Leo's father suddenly died, and the boy was suddenly an orphan. For the rest of his childhood, he was raised by a variety of kindly aunts. As with most privileged children, Tolstoy received his early education from tutors. one of them so ruthless that Tolstoy often felt his experience was where his belief in nonviolence got its start. The tutor not only whipped him, but locked him in a closet for hours at a time if he failed to do his work. When Tolstoy was 16, he finally escaped the tutor and enrolled at a university. But he was bored there. The lessons were unimaginative, and he was expected to behave like a proper young nobleman, which meant, as he described it, first and foremost, an excellent knowledge of French. The second condition was fingernails, long, manicured, and clean. The third was an ability to bow, dance, and make conversation. The fourth, and a very important one, was a constant expression of refined superior boredom. The boredom, at least, he could manage. In an effort to cure it, he joined the party crowd. He attended balls from sunset to sunrise, went to all-night drinking parties, and staggered home too late to make his morning classes. Disgusted by himself, he wrote up a list of rules for his own behavior. It was the first of many similar lists he would make throughout his life, and not the last that would have on it, "Keep away from women." At age 19, Tolstoy left the university without a degree and returned to his family estate, where he spent the first months reading and studying what he chose to study. He developed a passion for the philosophy of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, especially his ideas of equality, and even wore a medallion of Rousseau around his neck. He sewed himself a shapeless robe, which he tied around his waist with a cord. Then he came up with an impassioned plan for putting some of Rousseau's and his own theories into practice. He would reform the peasants. Tolstoy set out to educate the serfs and improve their living conditions, but to his shock, they didn't seem to want improvement. He bought them new, more efficient tools, and they insisted on using their old, clumsy wooden ones. He served them more nutritional and varied meals, and they persisted in eating their old, familiar porridge. When he started classes, none of the children attended. Their parents preferred to have them help in the fields. Tolstoy finally gave up in frustration and returned to the city. He spent a period in Moscow and St. Petersburg in which he fell into a self-indulgent lifestyle of gambling, partying, and numerous affairs with women, including servant girls and gypsies. He wrote to his brother, "I went to St. Petersburg without any reason. There I have done nothing necessary, only spent a heap of money and run up debts. You can't believe how it torments me." And in his diary, the simple confession, "I am living a completely brutish life." He became so restless and dissatisfied with himself that he made the choice many young men in his position made. He joined the army. He was 24 when he joined his brother in the Crimean War, where he distinguished himself with his bravery at the defense of Sevastopol. But the war brought two major disillusionments. One was the realization that war, far from being glamorous, was wretched and brutal. And the other, more personal, was that his lust was in desperate need of control. His conduct with the girls of the mountain tribes caused many confessions in his diary. "My life is extremely disorderly, so that I do not recognize myself, and I am ashamed to live like this. Sensuality gives me not a moment's peace. Girls have led me astray. I have done much evil. I live here wasting the best years of my life. It is stupid." But the army was far from being a waste. It was in these years that Tolstoy made his first attempts at writing serious fiction, reminiscences of his youth entitled Childhood. It was accepted by an editor who had the perception to write, "It seems to me that the author is a man of talent." When Tolstoy read that, he felt he had at last found his life's work. There were two sequels to Childhood, Boyhood, and Youth, and then a chronicle of his army years called Sevastopol Sketches. All were well received by both the public and critics, and Tolstoy found that he was now a famous writer, even though he was still in his 20s. The books were all known for their psychological detail, but it was the last work, Sevastopol Sketches, that broke new ground and astonished its readers with its vividly realistic depictions of the war. Instead of the usual romanticized glory, Tolstoy wrote grim descriptions of bloodbaths fought by unglamorous, ordinary men. Tolstoy never believed in heroes, and in fact, he would have taken exception to this very series, for he felt there was no such thing as greatness. He believed instead that history and events unfold as they are destined to, and people simply play whatever role is predestined for them with little effect on the outcome. By the time he was 28, Tolstoy had had enough of the army and returned to his estate, where he dedicated himself once again to reforming the life of the peasants. He set up another school, and this time it was successful. As an educator, Tolstoy was far ahead of his times. He believed that lessons should be adapted to the needs of each individual student, and that they should learn what they chose to learn, at whatever pace they could. In a magazine, he described his school. No one brings anything with him, neither books nor copybooks. No homework is set them. Not only do they carry nothing in their hands, they have nothing to carry even in their heads. They are not obliged to remember any lesson, nor any of yesterday's work. They bring only themselves and their receptive nature. Sometimes teacher and pupils are so carried away that a lesson lasts 3 hours instead of 1. Sometimes the pupils themselves cry out, "Go on, go on." When he published a journal about his ideas and experience in education and textbooks, which are known for their appealing simplicity, he influenced other educators throughout the world. Teaching was a happy episode in Tolstoy's life, but the craving to know the meaning of life persisted and rose to the surface again when his older brother died of consumption. Tolstoy wrote, "Wise, good, serious, he died painfully, not understanding why he had lived, and still less why he had to die. No theories could give me or him any reply to these questions during his slow and painful dying." When he was 34, Tolstoy fell in love. But love, like most things, was not an easy experience for him. The object of his affections was Sonia Bers, the sister of a friend, a pretty, well-educated young woman from the middle class, with warm brown eyes and a sentimental nature. But Tolstoy felt too awkward about his emotions to speak of them. Instead, he handed her acronyms and asked her to decipher them. One said YYAHRMTVOMA. With prodding, Sonia was able to decode it. "Your youth and happiness remind me too vividly of my age." Before proposing, Tolstoy let out an anguished stream of consciousness in his ever-present diary. "I am afraid of myself. What if it is only the desire for love and not love itself? Ugly mug, give up any thought of marriage. Your vocation is elsewhere. Delicious night, good, comfortable feeling. I was confused, she too. Don't go poking your nose into youth and poetry and beauty and love. There are cadets for that. I am in love as I did not believe it possible to be. I am insane. Tomorrow I shall go and speak out, or else I shall kill myself." Tolstoy did speak out, and Sonia happily agreed to become his wife. But first, Tolstoy made her read all his diaries, so she would know of his past sins and indiscretions. For many years, she was bitter that he'd done so. Much of what she read caused her misery and doubt. The marriage of Leo and Sonia Tolstoy was devoted but intense. In the first years, it was happily domestic. In the last years, it was plagued by conflict. The Tolstoys had 13 children, but 5 died young. It was in the first idyllic years of this marriage that Tolstoy began writing his most famous works, War and Peace and Anna Karenina. Sonia copied the manuscripts by hand, even though she was bearing and nursing children throughout, managing the estate and doing her best to keep her husband from being disturbed and distracted. When he was 48, the spiritual crisis that had been brewing within for years finally bubbled its way to the surface. On the outside, there seemed no reason for discontent. He was happily married, famous, wealthy, and at work on a promising new novel. He had 6 healthy, joyous children, and his house was full of laughter. The entire family kept diaries, played piano and sang together, went sleigh riding, fishing, and horseback riding, looked over the illustrations for War and Peace, put on plays and costume balls, and delighted each other with stories and jokes. None of this, to Tolstoy, felt real. All of it would pass. And what would remain? What in it all was lasting, eternal, and unchanging? He was dissatisfied with himself, and he was obsessed with one all-consuming question. Why do I live? While writing Anna Karenina, he became so filled with despair he even contemplated suicide. His mind was so rapidly being restructured, he became convinced he was insane, and Sonia was filled with terror that he might be right. The question of the meaning of life only became more urgent when, in a period of a little over 2 years, he lost his favorite aunt and 3 of his young children, one a year old, another barely a year old, and the third only a few minutes after birth. Desperate for answers, he at first tried the writings of philosophers, scientists, and theologians, but they left him unsatisfied. It was from the peasants he finally found the answer for which he was searching. They told him the key was selflessness. One must not live for oneself. One must live to serve God. Then, one day in spring, while walking through the forest, Tolstoy threw himself to the ground and began to pray. Overcome with despair at the thought there might not be a God, he shouted into the stillness, "Lord, have mercy, save me!" And then suddenly and quietly and without any doubt, he knew. He was filled with the awareness from deep in his heart that a compassionate being understood his search and had responded. "He exists!" exclaimed Tolstoy. Writing of the experience later, Tolstoy described what happened next. He was revered by strangers, the more the tension increased at home. The disciples arrived in droves, calling themselves Tolstoyans, all of them dressed simply and sharing his beliefs in nonviolence and his abhorrence of oppression. His wife Sonia and some of his children hated the constant visitors to the farm, many of whom they saw as nothing more than tramps. Sonia called them all the dark people. New ones arrived every day, and some were so devoted and helpful to Tolstoy that it aroused her jealousy. There was also continuous conflict over Tolstoy's attitude towards money and property. The only member of his family who never wavered in her devotion and support was Tolstoy's youngest daughter, Sasha, who was a disciple herself and who later became his biographer. As Tolstoy entered his 70s, he was still working vigorously in the fields, usually for 3 hours without stopping. Twice he hiked the 130 miles to Moscow and back in the peasant style. He wrote letters of protest to government officials and even the Tsar about the treatment of peasants. And when the crops failed in Russia, he devoted himself to famine relief work. The more committed he became, the angrier became his wife. Sonia's animosity was so great that she had bouts of hysteria when she screamed at him, threatened suicide, and locked herself outdoors, hidden in a ditch while the entire household searched for her. Now the fear in the Tolstoy home was that Sonia was going insane. She badgered Tolstoy constantly until his health began to suffer. He suffered several small strokes, but continued to work in the fields and to write each day, even returning to fiction. The writing was made easier by the gift of a dictaphone, a gift from an admirer in America named Thomas Edison. Many of Tolstoy's admirers were among the most prominent people in the world. Besides his correspondence with Gandhi, he often exchanged letters with dramatist George Bernard Shaw. The famous American statesman William Jennings Bryan even gave up an audience with the Tsar in order to spend an extra day with Tolstoy on his farm. On his 80th birthday, he received over 2,000 telegrams of congratulations from around the world. Tolstoy was never comfortable in the role of teacher and idol, but he was even more uncomfortable with the attention this role brought to his personal life, which he increasingly felt was one of hypocrisy. He was always keenly aware of the contradiction between his beliefs and the way his family lived. He preferred the life of a mystic, free from worldly possessions and dedicated to service to others. They preferred the traditional and comfortable life of their class. While he spoke of denouncement of the material, they lived in a sprawling estate with servants. And worse yet, with the exception of his daughter Sasha, they constantly criticized and interfered with his own life. Tolstoy was 82 years old when he finally decided he could no longer endure living on his estate. He wasn't sure where he would go, but he knew he had to leave. In the middle of the night, he and Sasha packed their bags, left a note of apology for Sonia, and slipped away to the railroad station. Tolstoy waited in a freezing wind until a train arrived, then boarded a second-class car. First, he went to the convent where his sister Maria lived, and together they looked for a peasant hut where he might live. The letters from Sonia began arriving almost immediately, begging him to come back, threatening suicide, accusing him of desertion, and promising to, in her words, cure herself. Tolstoy wrote back that he loved her with all his heart, but that to return to the estate was to renounce life. Early the next morning, unable to find a peasant hut and unhappy Sonia had found him, Tolstoy boarded another train, unsure where to go. He complained of feeling chilly and asked to have rugs wrapped around his legs. Soon he had a fever. At the next station, in the village of Ostapovo, Sasha took him off the train and had him put to bed. A doctor found his temperature had risen to 104 degrees. Sasha wired home. In the following days, the last of Tolstoy's life, his children managed to sneak into the station, one at a time, to speak their farewells. Sonia, furious, was kept at a distance, for fear her hysteria would destroy his last moments of peace. Some of his family members, fearful of his impending death, tried to convince him to reconcile with the church. His response was, "Even in the valley of the shadow of death, 2 and 2 do not make 6. Tolstoy asked Sasha to record his last thoughts in his ever-present diary. He dictated, "God is that unlimited whole of which man is a limited part. Only God truly exists." 2 days later, he slipped into unconsciousness, mumbling, "Search, always keep searching." While he was unconscious, Tolstoy's hand moved across the bed covers, writing with an imaginary pencil. A few days later, he regained consciousness for a moment and spoke his last words. When he slipped into unconsciousness again, Sonia was brought in to kiss him goodbye. Outside the station, the crowds grew as word spread that the great writer was dying. He died on November 20th, 1910, at the age of 82, in a remote railway station on the way to an unknown destination. His last words had been, "Truth, I love much." A few days later, a line of mourners over a mile long, including peasants, workers, and nobility, followed the plain wooden coffin into the forest, where Tolstoy was buried. It was the same forest where 75 years earlier he'd searched for a green stick that held the secrets of life and peace. It's hard to know which was more impressive, Leo Tolstoy's life or Leo Tolstoy's work. Both were epic in proportion, and both were filled with the torment and the beauty of the human condition. In spite of the many years he spent writing about his beliefs, Tolstoy is best known for his novels. All his fiction is admired for its extraordinary detail and profound psychological insights. War and Peace was his first masterpiece and is still considered to be among the top 2 or 3 greatest novels in world literature. To many people, it's the greatest of all. It is certainly one of the most massive. The book is about 1,500 pages long, and it took Tolstoy 7 years of almost continuous writing to complete it. War and Peace was not the author's first choice for a title. Originally, he wanted to call it The Year 1805. Then he changed that to All's Well That Ends Well. Finally, he settled on War and Peace, which captured the grand panorama of the novel. It appeared in serialized version between the years 1863 and 1869, the same years the United States was fighting and recovering from its Civil War. War and Peace is set in the times of the invasion of Russia by Napoleon. In this amazing book, Tolstoy took on the enormous task of chronicling the lives of several families against the backdrop of the war, from birth to childhood to marriage to childbirth to old age and to death. We watch all of the main characters as they grow to maturity and search for the meaning in their lives. There are aristocrats and peasants, army officers and privates, the French and Russian emperors, diplomats and courtiers, living their lives in cities, towns, farms, and battlefields. The book is also a superb historical novel. It describes the political and military events that occurred in Europe during a 15-year period from 1805 to 1820. The story focuses mostly on Napoleon's invasion of Russia in 1812. The novel is a reflection of Tolstoy's personal belief, which he clearly stated in the book, that history proceeds towards its own predestined end. There are no great men. Prominent people and heroes actually have no significant impact on the course of history. The structure of War and Peace, with all its complex characters and settings, is considered one of the greatest technical achievements in the history of the novel. Tolstoy himself was sometimes overwhelmed by the challenge of it. Early on, when still just planning the story, he wrote to a friend, "You cannot imagine how hard I find the preliminary labor of plowing deep the field in which I must sow, to consider and reconsider all that may happen to all the future characters in the very large work I am preparing, and to weigh millions of possible combinations is terribly difficult." Anna Karenina was written about 10 years after War and Peace, when Tolstoy was 47. In between the two, he'd undergone a transformation. While War and Peace is optimistic and life-affirming, Anna Karenina is pessimistic. It was published in installments between the years 1875 and 1877, while Tolstoy was deeply troubled about the meaning and purpose of life. On the surface, it's a compelling tragedy about adultery, but beneath the surface are deep social and spiritual themes. Tolstoy particularly explores the morals and hypocrisy of the Russian aristocracy and the role of religious faith in one's life. Like War and Peace, Anna Karenina weaves together several plots and presents a vast, detailed picture of Russia. It has all the psychological perception of his first masterpiece, but it's smaller in scope and doesn't include the philosophical reflections that some critics thought interfered with the plot of War and Peace. Tolstoy modeled one character in the book, named Levin, after himself. It's through Levin that Tolstoy expresses many of his own views about society, humankind, and God. He also modeled the marriage of Levin and Kitty after his own marriage, before it began to crumble. There were other works that followed his two famous novels, although most are unknown to the broad public. Other fiction works included the story The Death of Ivan Ilyich, which is chiefly about an empty life without meaning, and the novel Resurrection, a story about a nobleman who is spiritually reformed. For years, Tolstoy wrote only non-fiction pieces about his religious, political, and educational beliefs. One of the best of these is an essay called What is Art?, which he wrote when he was 70 years old, and able to reflect on all he'd accomplished and all he felt he hadn't accomplished. In this essay, he argued that the artist is morally bound to create works that the majority of people can understand and relate to. For that reason, he dismissed his own earlier works, including War and Peace and Anna Karenina, as failures. He also rejected the work of other artists, including Shakespeare and Wagner, for the same reasons. He said that the main requirement of art was that it morally uplift people and help them to improve, something else he felt he'd failed at. He called his masterpieces, which the world has so loved for over a century, aristocratic art, written from vanity and of no service to the common person. The highest art was that which he called religious art, which in his words was art flowing from the love of God and man. Leo Tolstoy was a man who lived almost his entire life in the pursuit of perfection, both personally and creatively. He constantly analyzed his own motives and behavior as he analyzed his work. Just as he hoed and plowed the fields of his farm, so did he plow the depths of his mind and soul. Although it caused him almost excruciating pain and anguish, he was tireless in his search for truth. Even at the age of 82, he roused himself to continue that search, though this last journey meant his death. It was the unwavering belief of Leo Tolstoy that the perfection of each individual relied on their obedience to truth, which to him was Christian love. He recognized that this truth was not obtained without struggle, without work, without suffering, all of which he endured in the faith it would transform him and his world. He did not believe in greatness, but he seems to have believed in much more.
This is the end of the session.